Hi, my name's Kristen Slagle, and for my paper I looked at the primary causes of population decline in African great apes. So the problem that they are facing right now is non-human primate populations are facing a global decline. About 75% of primate species have declining populations, and 60% are being threatened with extinction. The leading causes of population decline in primates include hunting, predation, habitat loss, and disease. There are a variety of other reasons, but these four are the main four. For my paper, I focused solely on habitat loss and disease just because those are two of the bigger ones. So I will be focusing on African great apes. So that is the chimpanzees, the bonobos, and the gorillas. So first, for chimpanzees, there are four subspecies: the eastern, western, central, and Nigerian Cameroon. There are about 150,000 to 250,000 chimps left in the world. This is a rough estimate just because a lot of the land is unexplored and it is very difficult to track chimpanzee groups. From 1990 to 2014, the West chimpanzee population declined 80.2%, which left them classified as critically endangered. This is a trend among the other subspecies of chimps, so the eastern, central, and Nigerian Cameroon. For bonobos, they are also known as the dwarf chimpanzee or the pygmy chimp. The populations for those have declined by 54.9% between 2003 and 2015, and they are currently classified as endangered by the IUCN Red List. Bonobo population size is expected to decline 85.6% in the next 25 years and 99.7% in 75 years. So in 100 years or so, it is very likely that bonobos will be extinct. Gorillas. For gorillas, the subspecies are eastern lowland gorilla and western lowland gorilla. Western lowland gorilla populations have decreased nearly 60% in the past 20 to 25 years. Eastern gorilla populations have decreased 77% since 1994. Both of these population declines are largely due to hunting, habitat loss, and disease. So first I'm going to focus on disease. Epidemics including the simian immunodeficiency virus, Ebola, and anthrax have caused significant drops in African ape populations. Simian immunodeficiency virus is also known as SIV. It is the primate version of HIV. It's characterized by a severely weakened immune system, which causes individuals with SIV to be more susceptible to contracting disease and less likely to recover from sickness or infection. They may also become infertile. It's also easily spread throughout a population. So this can be a problem for a variety of reasons. One of them is the younger chimpanzees are dying because they are contracting disease and infection more easily and they're unlikely to recover. So that means the death rate is higher, and those affected who are still living can be infertile, so that's less reproduction. So with a higher death rate and lower reproductive rate, it doesn't look very good. To the right is a picture that shows the gut microbiome as the disease progresses. In the early stages, it is stable, but in the late stages, when they have less than 6 months to live, it is unstable, and that shows their immune system becoming very bad. It also can be used if they look at that gut microbiome to determine if they have SIV, and this will show them when veterinary care needs to happen and when they can wait a little longer. Anthrax is another thing with disease. It's a bacteria that causes shock-like symptoms, respiratory failure, sepsis, and death. It is characterized by black dead tissue, gastroenteritis, and flu-like symptoms. So in 2002, B. anthrax was deemed the cause of death of 6 chimpanzees who were studied after sudden death in Thai National Park, which labeled the disease as a threat to chimpanzee populations. Ebola, we all know Ebola. It is a deadly virus that changes how blood clots. It causes damage to the lining of the blood cells, causing hemorrhaging and bleeding from the eyes and nose. It attacks different tissues and cells that lead to circulatory failure and causes multiple organ failure. So these Ebola outbreaks have wiped out many chimpanzee populations and killed nearly 95% of individuals in affected western lowland gorilla populations. So Ebola, especially for gorillas, is very dangerous for populations. So something I looked at in my paper is disease more of a threat than previously thought? So I looked at many studies that looked at disease, but they were like, they didn't really think that it was a threat to an extent of other things. Some of them did label it as a threat, but a significant amount didn't, which is why I looked into this. One of the examples I used was one paper that looked at 11 chimps that died after experiencing sudden death. The cause of death for 4 of the chimpanzees was deemed to be from conspecific trauma, which means one of their own killed them, another chimpanzee, and diseases were not seen as a threat to current population. However, based on behavior, it is possible that the conspecific trauma was linked to disease. So looking at the data for that, we have 2 here that did die from the AIDS-like disease, so they both had the SIV, which does, like I said before, hurt their immune system and make them die earlier. And then we had one here from trauma. It had hind limb paralysis, and I believe in the paper it said it fell out of a tree. And it did have SIV and SFV, which is another disease. And then 4 at the very end died from the conspecific trauma. Only one of them had SIV, and one of them, they did not know if they had it or not. So looking at this, there is enough that had SIV that did die from this trauma. So when chimps are in a group and one of their own is sick and unable to keep up with the group, or they're getting older, it is not uncommon for them to attack that chimp and potentially kill it because it is unable to keep up with the group. I believe that could have happened with the trauma, with the hind limb paralysis. Chimps will push each other out of trees, and it's not very likely that if they're studying this, they would be able to tell if it was pushed out or it fell out. They just know that it fell out of the tree, so it was labeled as trauma. The other ones, if they saw wounds from other chimps, they would just think they got in fights, but again, the reasons for those fights is what really caused the death. And chimps are very smart, so usually when they do attack one another, they have a reason, and they don't really do it just randomly, so it is likely that it could have been because they had those diseases, especially one of them who was 44 years old. That is very old for a chimp, and if it had SFV, which it did, it's likely that it couldn't catch up, so therefore it could have been attacked. So what I'm saying here is, although it looks like trauma for all of these, and papers commonly label trauma as cause of death instead of other underlying factors, it may not be actually the cause of death. So I think that they must look more into behavior in the future to determine what really is causing this portion of population decline. So next, I'm going to be looking at habitat loss. So the amount of sustainable environmental conditions, otherwise known as SEC, for African great apes has rapidly decreased in size in recent decades. Between the 1990s and the 2000s, about 208,000 kilometers square out of 2 million of suitable habitat for great apes was lost in Africa. Because great apes do travel in large groups, they require a large amount of land for foraging and to keep distance from neighboring groups. So if too much habitat fragmentation happens, it severely limits the amount of land that groups are able to survive on for long periods of times. A specific version of habitat loss is palm oil. It is the world's most consumed vegetable oil and makes up nearly 60% of all oils and fats. Most palm oil production currently takes place in Southeast Asia. It has a highly negative impact on orangutan populations. Orangutans are another great ape. They're just not an African great ape, so they're not focused on in this specific paper. However, in many African countries, more than 75% of suitable environmental conditions overlap with suitable palm oil areas, and much of this is unprotected, and West African apes and the Central African apes are most vulnerable to extreme habitat loss in the future. So currently, like I said, orangutan populations have been widely affected by this. There are movements going on within zoos to stay away from products that use palm oil. That way they can be saved. So a lot of scientists are thinking that African great apes will have a similar, will go through a similar thing as the orangutan populations, and they want to keep that from happening. And because so much of African great ape habitat does have that palm oil in it, they are very worried about them losing a lot of habitat. So looking at the table on the right, you can see how much global palm oil production has grown within recent years. This alone, looking at 1999 to 2014, it is more than doubled, and that is keep rising now. Now in 2020, it is likely a lot higher, and now that it's expanding to Africa, it's likely that it's going to increase a lot more because they have a lot more sources. So conservation efforts, right now, 34 zoos across the United States take part in the Chimpanzee and Gorilla Species Survival Plan, otherwise known as SSP, where they assist in conservation through research, education, advocacy, and husbandry. Parks such as Gombe National Park and Virunga National Park, excuse me if those are wrong, but give their apes regular access to veterinary care and provide protected land to live on. This is free from poaching and the threat of habitat loss. However, governments must work towards protecting African great apes from habitat loss and enforce laws against poaching and illegal logging. So saying this, like I said before, by putting restrictions on certain areas that have palm oil so that they don't lose too much habitat. Further research needs to be done to evaluate the updated extent of population loss, since a lot of habitats have not been searched, mainly for chimpanzees and bonobos, and they need to look at habitat loss and transfer disease. So in conclusion, chimpanzees, bonobos, and gorillas are classified as endangered by the IUCN Red List and continue to decline in population size. Diseases such as SIV, Ebola, and anthrax come in epidemics and make recovery extremely difficult. Habitat loss through factors such as palm oil expansion have left suitable habitat fragmented and unable to sustain large groups of great apes. Current efforts to preserve the species include access to national parks where the threat of habitat loss and poaching is minimal, and the AZA accredited zoos taking part in the species survival plan. Thank you.